Welcome back. Our next conversation is hosted by the Civic Learning and Democracy Engagement Coalition, exploring whether revitalized civic education can help higher education regain public trust in this polarized moment. I want to welcome the whole panel. At this time, I want to welcome our distinguished panel, chaired by Tom Merrill of American University, Leah Epperson from the Washington College of Law, Hans Zeiger from the Jack Miller Center, Geary Schneider from CLDE and AU, and Amit, Sevak, the CEO of ETS Global Education and Talent Services. Let's listen as they examine the promise and the limits of civic learning as a democratic renewal strategy. Welcome to the stage, everyone.
Great. Great. Is this on? Can you hear me? Great. Okay. So I'm Tom Merrill. I'm a faculty member here at AU, and I'm the chair of the Civic Learning for Democracy Engagement, which I've practiced, so I hope I got it right. Carol, please tell me if I didn't get it right. My job here is I'm the pitcher, and these folks are going to be the batters. So I'm looking forward to lots of home runs. So we're here to talk about civic education at the university level, and we're in a context in which the country is extremely polarized, and we feels like we're in a civic crisis of various kinds. Perhaps our panelists will say something about that. It is also in the context in which civic education in the K through 12 system has, by at least some accounts, been long under-resourced and underappreciated. I think one statistic that I saw that as a nation, we spend something like 5 cents on civics for every $50 that we spend on STEM. So it might be an area that we could profitably afford to invest more in the K through 12 area. But we're here today to talk about higher education. What's the role of higher education in civics education? We did hear some from the sign poll today that students want more civil discourse and more engagement across differences, respectful engagement, not what we see on the internet. So that's the context. I'm going to throw questions out to the audience or to the panelists. We go through a series of questions. We are planning on stopping sharply at 20 minutes before the end so we can get questions from the audience. So and I'm going to start with just by asking, why is it important to teach civics in colleges and universities now? You guys can jump in as you see fit, but I'm going to start by going to Amit. Thank you, Amit.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here. Good morning. So the question is, why is it important to teach civics in colleges and universities in the US? Just look at what's going on. I mean, right now we've got a democracy in crisis. There's so many ways to look at this question, but fundamentally, higher education plays such an important role in helping to develop future leaders, helping to develop foundation knowledge. And your point on STEM is well taken. I remember that big focus on STEM. And it actually produced a lot of good in this country, right? We have this incredible innovation orientation, the building of products and services, supporting biotech and technology and so much innovation. And I think that the opportunity now is to really paint a strong picture. ETS, our organization, is known for all kinds of assessments. Many of you have taken our assessments in high school or in college over the years.
We're still scarred.
Yes, exactly. You turned out pretty well, though, so I'm going to take some credit for that. So, and my son just took the SAT on Saturday, so he came out going, "Dad, why do you do this stuff?" You know, it's just like, so I appreciate that. One of the things that's less known is that ETS is also the primary administrator of NAEP. So NAEP is the National Assessment for Educational Progress. Every 2 years across the 50 states, we administer on behalf of the US government an assessment on literacy, on math, and we also measure civics. And one of the last civic results was quite sobering. It showed that 78% of 8th graders in America are not proficient in the foundational skills of civics. So NAEP measures civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic dispositions. So knowledge are, foundational knowledge of how the American political system works. Skills are how do you apply them, such as in communication, debate, empathy, engagement with another person on a discussion. And then you've got dispositions, which are more like mindsets, like understanding what common good means. And so the fact that 4 out of 5 eighth graders are not at proficient level in civics is reinforcing your point on the lack of investment. And so we have lots of red lights all over saying we need to teach more in middle school, in high school, and in higher ed. And on your question on higher ed specifically, I think it's because there is this moment right now where higher ed is under a lot of pressure, but higher ed can, and I think Alex on the last panel articulated it well, that critical thinking and jobs are the 2 main areas that students want. And so if you're thinking about one of the key ways to frame this, I think, for us in higher ed, is to think about civics very closely linked with actually job-related skills, right? Because if we think about communication, collaboration, critical thinking, those are the same skills you need in the world of work, particularly in a world of AI where so many activities are getting automated. Those human skills still matter for work, but those human skills still matter to be a citizen. And one way I've heard frame it recently is to think about what we in higher ed are doing are producing productive citizens with a notion on workforce development and a notion on civic development. So I'd love to see every higher ed institution in America have a civic transcript that complements a traditional transcript. I just think it's that important at this moment to really refocus higher ed's incredibly important role on stabilizing those foundational skills.
Great, thank you. The rest of the panel have thoughts about why civics at the higher ed level now?
A lot of people hear the word civics and they think about K-12. They think, okay, taking a course in middle school and the 3 branches of government and how many members of Congress and so forth, which, we need that. But I like what you call this initiative that you're building here at AU, civic life, because civic engagement, civic learning is a lifelong thing. It is not just something that you can, confine to one little part of your K-12 education. It is every bit as much the business of higher education as it is K-12 education. And one of the major reasons for that, there are a number of reasons, but one of the major reasons is that there's decent chance that if you're going into a leadership kind of a role in our society, you're getting a college education, and the kinds of preparation that we need for thought leaders and K-12 teachers and journalists and business leaders and political leaders deserves attention to civic matters, an understanding of our constitutional order, the habits of thinking that are required and conversation that are required in a free society. These are not things that you can just sort of get in a moment. They require practice and they require teaching, and so we need to take that seriously in higher education.
So thank you for putting this panel together. Thank you all for joining us. I'm from the Civic Learning and Democracy Engagement Coalition, and if you want to know what that is, that's the blue handout on your tables, and it will tell you something about what we're doing to try to make civic part of higher education in a way that will connect with students' actual interests. But I want to dwell in answer to Tom's question on the connection between civic learning and democracy engagement. Every student in America is part of we the people. We the people are the sovereigns in this democracy. And most of we the people don't know very much about our democracy. There's a recent survey that comes out every year from Annenberg showing that of students, only 70% can identify free speech as protected by the First Amendment. But trivial numbers know the other things that are protected. And the things that the First Amendment protects are the ways in which we actually influence change in our democracy. So we have a huge amount of work to do across school and college to broaden, strengthen, and deepen the preparation students have for their roles in making a more perfect democracy. And we have a long way to go on that. But we also have a lot of work to do to help everybody understand that this is part of what it means to go to college. I'll come back to that later, because needless to say, we have a lot of thoughts about that in the coalition. But the key point, we need to center democracy in our preparation for participation in a self-governing democracy.
Good morning. Is this working?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. And I feel like, you know, some of what we are talking about, we are echoing one another. But I, as a constitutional law professor, am a big fan of learning civic education and also learning what it means to be in a constitutional democracy. I think it's important at the higher ed level for a number of reasons. One is, as my co-panelists have said, I really think education is a democracy driver. It is how we understand how to be active and full participants in a democracy. If you don't have that civic education, you don't have that baseline of knowledge. When we talk about the title of this, the crisis of democracy, how can you envision how you will function in this crisis? What changes you may want to see, what you believe in if you don't have that baseline of knowledge. And it is very evident from the NAEP statistics that Amit provided that students are not getting enough at the K-12 level. So they're coming to our higher ed institutions with very different levels of knowledge. And when we think about our democracy, when we think about coming upon the 250th anniversary, the idea that this document is a living, breathing constitution with 27 amendments and a whole incredible history that goes along with that, I think it's very important for students to be able to understand those foundations, because we don't really have a self-executing democratic self-determination. Every generation has to be involved. Every generation has to have a stake in it. And in order to have that stake, you have to understand the depth and the breadth of our beautiful, majestic, and also fraught history. And so I think that is critical for anyone, whether you are going to be in a career that deals with this, or whether you're going to just be participating in our democracy. It's critical that we have that knowledge.
Great, thank you. So one thing, as a person who works on a campus trying to think about what would this look like practically, one very quickly gets out of the realm of the ideals and lofty language that one might have on a panel. And people ask, well, what do we really mean by civics? Like concretely, what does this mean? And sometimes it seems to me that when people talk about civics, they mean something like productive dialogue, constructive dialogue, dialogue across differences, but something that's really a skill of individuals or disposition of individuals. And sometimes it seems like we're talking about a body of knowledge. So when Carol cites the fact that people can't name what the amendments are, that's an example of knowledge. Which do you think is more important, and how do you think those work together as we think about what civics could actually mean in the university?
I actually think you can't have one without the other.
Okay.
I mean, sorry, I do feel strongly about the whole basis of knowledge and the skills that you're talking about in terms of the discourse. I think one of the ways in which we get tripped up with having even increased sort of polarization and difficulty in having dialogue is a lack of knowledge. And that's a lack of knowledge of, I'm talking about it, and Carol has mentioned in terms of what do those amendments mean? What, even in a moment like today, what does it mean to have the Reconstruction amendments that fundamentally change the fabric of our social contract? If you've never studied them and you don't know about the sort of second founding and Thaddeus Stevens and Bingham and Charles Sumner, then, it's difficult to have an engaging discussion about it. And so I think that baseline of knowledge, that body of knowledge, which is obviously part of my work, is critical, but it's not the only thing. And in order to have those skills that you're talking about, I think this also goes to this dearth of, it's for better or worse, it's a dearth of also what we have in the life cycle of education. So when we think about K-12 education in the United States, some people may have lofty ideals of, what Brown versus Board of Education stood for, and it broke the back of legal apartheid in America. But our schools are more racially and economically segregated today than they have been in several decades. And so if students don't have an early chance, an ability to learn across difference, to be able to sit in a classroom with people who come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, different religions, different political viewpoints, different family experiences, then the first time they encounter that difference is with us. And I think that's far too late.
I agree. I agree with Leah because, I mean, if you think about, take another subject outside of civics. Take, for example, English, right? We all had English in high school or some other early stage in life, and English has 4 categories. You've got listening, speaking, reading, and writing. You've got 4 pieces that work together to form a foundation of being a literate person in a context of engaging in English, right? And it's a similar idea to be a literate person, to be a civically engaged, that you've got the components to your question, Tom. I mean, there's the knowledge of civics. There's the foundational knowledge of what is it to be in a democracy in this context in the United States, the branches of government, how do you function? And then there's the skills of how do you engage civically, listening, respect, understanding what voting means, how do you engage? And then there's what are sometimes called dispositions or mindset, which are a bit more enduring. These are more enduring aspects. I was referring to that notion of common good or other more enduring traits. And I think that these things really work together. We were having, during our prep session, when we were doing the prep for panel, we were having a good discussion about if you had to pick one, what would it be? And I was offering, and I agree with Leah, that all of them work together. But at this particular moment, as I think about the next few years, and I think about how do we engage college students in civics, I'm more leaning towards the behavioral aspect, the skills aspects. Because I think project-based learning, getting out there, doing projects, often can internalize these skills in very different ways from the theory side or the knowledge side. The knowledge side is super critical because you need those foundational skills. But I think in this world where edutainment and TikTok and a lot of these much more behavioral activities tend to reinforce these skills much more fundamentally, I think I'd want to encourage us as we think about reimagining how to incorporate civics back into higher ed for both undergrad and grad school to emphasize more of these kind of projects and skills and hands-on learning, things that can really engage. I think that'll provide a broader group of our country's students a chance to really engage in more fresh and different ways and make it fun.
So again, you have on your table the coalition's answer to this question. One of the first things we did when we began our work in 2021 was to ask across higher education, educators and people beyond education, what should civic learning in a democracy include? And pretty much all the things that have been mentioned in the first set of answers to Tom's questions are in that framework. Our challenge is to try to figure out how to bring them together in a meaningful way so that they connect with what we just heard in the last hour about students' actual interests. So I want to bring the word problem solving and problem-centered inquiry more broadly to the center of this conversation. Yes, we need knowledge. Yes, we need skills. Yes, we need practical experiences. Yes, we need to prepare students for careers. But we can bring questions to which we don't know the answer, directly into the center of our general education, our career fields, and we can lift up the civic and ethical implications of the things that students think they came to college to study. They want to be prepared for a job, fine. Bring the civic inquiry into their job preparation, lay a foundation in general education, but then have it weave through the curriculum. The longer handout on your table shows what we mean by this, how you would actually do it. But I want to center the notion of engaging students with problems to which we don't actually know the answer. No, not on information that we're delivering to them as experts, but things where they have to figure it out together and figure it out in relation to their responsibilities as civic-minded professionals and as citizens in a self-governing democracy. And I say that especially, I was kind of intrigued by the fact that only 20-some% of students thought it was important to work on AI in college. Is there anybody in higher education who doesn't think we have to work on that? We know they need to. But AI is delivering to every single field a whole slew of justice, integrity, fairness, inclusion. You know, what are these algorithms? Who is advantaged by them? Who is disadvantaged? Every single field is now going to be struggling with a problem-centered question to which we don't know the answer and where everybody has a stake in it. So I think we need to think developmentally in terms of pathways, not a course, not just the knowledge, laying the foundation of knowledge, but taking it directly to where students think they came to college to be ready for a job, and to help them think more broadly and more creatively about what it means to be a well-prepared professional in a democracy.
I agree completely about the compatibility of civic knowledge and skills, dispositions or virtues. Those things all go together, But and I come from a background of public service. I was 10 years as a state legislator in my home state of Washington. Won my first election by 29 votes out of 52,000 cast, running against an incumbent. And every vote matters. Never let anybody tell you it doesn't. But so voting matters, engagement matters, all of that. But if I had to kind of summarize the one thing that I think matters the most in governance, after having served in a governance role, it is thoughtfulness. And that's not just something you need if you're an elected official. It's something that anybody in our free society needs, is thoughtfulness. And that comes out in the way we discuss issues with one another, the way that we think about those issues when we go into leadership roles. And the thing I think about first is George Washington, when he gave his first State of the Union address, he's thinking about what's important for this new country that's getting its act together. And he said civic education needs to be a priority. And he was advocating actually for a national university. He thought that civics was something that needed to be emphasized at a higher education level. And we've never had a national university in the way that he envisioned and others have envisioned over time. But it's significant that he wanted it to be in the nation's capital. American University is here. The Civic Life Initiative, Sign Institute, the things that you all are part of, I think are very significant in the continuity of that vision. But what he talked about, he actually went on to list subjects that citizens ought to be prepared to think about. The difference between liberty and tyranny, the nature of our rights and our responsibilities. What does it take to govern this complex society? So he listed out these things. Worth going back and reading that. I would recommend that. And so I think about that a lot when I think about, okay, what do we need? We need thoughtful citizens. We need thinking citizens.
I was just on a panel a couple of weeks ago with some AI experts. And on this theme of AI that Carol was mentioning and building on your point around the incredible founding importance of critical thinking and thoughtfulness, I was stunned when the discussion was, okay, how do you actually in the current moment develop civic skills? And these are AI experts. These are computer scientists at Stanford, at UCLA. And they all said critical thinking. They all said if there's one muscle we need to develop in a world of AI in college, it's actually the critical thinking component. Yes, communication is important to me. Yes, collaboration is important. But the moment right now is for us to really strengthen individuals' capacity to develop a sense of agency, to make thoughtful choices, to interpret hallucinations from AI, to interpret false data, to interpret and when there's advertising or manipulation happening, how do you independently judge that? And that's the muscle that we have to, and I remember one of the Stanford professors saying that's the biggest, most urgent skill we have to develop right now. Because if at the rate we're going with AI and the ubiquity with which students are just adopting it, ChatGPT and so forth, just having that muscle really be strengthened is the greatest form of civic strengthening we can do in higher ed right now.
So I see that I have failed to provoke any disagreement amongst my colleagues. We'll see if we can do better as we go forward. No, but everything you guys have said has been beautiful. Should there be a difference between teaching civics in K through 12 education and higher education? This is the question that we talked about in our prep meeting. And partly we think about higher education as having a different task, not opposed, but a different task than K through 12, because we're supposed to be, we call it critical thinking, but I think it really indicates a kind of willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, even a sense of, dare I say it, anarchism. So maybe I can put a point on this question. Do you think someone like Marx should be part of a civic curriculum? Is there a difference between what we do in higher ed and what we do in K through 12? This is a surprise question. Or not? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. across the continuum from school through college, we need to be engaging people with the critiques that have been offered of the world that we're part of and the ones that have had influence in our society. I certainly want to endorse what Leah said before about teaching, making sure that more than once from school through college, students have spent time on that second founding and then on the extension of rights and liberty to everybody, and not just, well, at the time, to all men, and not just to the people who were present when the Constitution was written. But yes, Marx should be part of it. But it's not so much a question of what texts are we reading. It's sort of understanding that in higher education, we're giving students practice, I'll take the term muscle that Amit just used, practice in the muscle of thinking through complex questions thoughtfully, but also with an eye toward what they themselves think is the right thing to do. I would argue that what we're getting at in higher education is helping students develop an examined sense of their own civic agency and purpose, and understand what they want to play as a role in their democracy, to understand, as I've said before, the civic and ethical and social responsibility questions that will come up in their fields. So any provocative text can get you into this conversation. But the question is, do we have a clear understanding of what we want students to be thinking about as a result of having engaged with Marx or Jane Addams or anyone else we want to put in the curriculum?
I've heard civic education described as a layer cake. You know, from the earliest years, you should be gaining some appreciation of your belonging in a community, a political community, and some sense that you're part of a local community, a nation, the world, et cetera. But increasingly, you should engage with texts. You should read the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, some of the great speeches throughout our country's history, and that helps to form a context for wrestling with contemporary debates and topics, and then you should engage in those debates with your peers in a classroom setting. And so higher education should be a continuation of that as you study more deeply about our country's political tradition. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
You wanted a little controversy, a little debate, try to mix it up. All right, so I'll take a stab at this in the spirit of civic engagement. Right now, the American higher education system is not delivering at a broad level on one of the key priorities that Alex articulately said on the panel earlier, which is jobs. 40% of American graduates are underemployed right after they graduate, meaning they didn't need a college degree to get the job that they're in. 40%, right? It's approaching half. So if half of American graduates are in a job right out of college that they didn't need a college degree for, 4 years of tuition or longer, sometimes 5, 6, 7, the time spent, the opportunity cost of other activities, we're not delivering on one of the key things that one of our most important stakeholders, the student, if not the most important stakeholder, wants. So the first problem we have is we're not delivering on the higher education promise of upward economic mobility on a consistent basis. Sure, great institutions like American here are having incredible outcomes. I've seen the outcomes here, and they're phenomenal. But on average, across American higher ed, we're not delivering on the promise of a reliable, high-paying job that's appropriate for the return on investment that you get. And certainly we're seeing unemployment increase, right? Just the last 3 years, unemployment is increasing each year, just straight unemployment, not getting any job out of college. So if that's one of the core opportunities right now, I do think, to answer your question, I do think higher ed does have an opportunity to have a distinctive civic orientation that's much more tied. And I really like where Carol was going, so here I'm agreeing.
Stop it.
Well, we got to stop agreeing. But I do agree with the principle of looking for problems. And I wanted to offer that maybe the problems are partly workplace problems, right? That could incorporate a little bit of civics in there as well, right? So you give kids spaghetti, but you put a little bit of peas in there, a little bit of goodness, so they get some veggies. But the idea is to have some much more orientation towards workforce. Now that's controversial. I've been on many conversations where I've had been in context with leaders of higher ed where they're like, no, it's about research, or no, it's about a civic discourse. But I want to make the case that on average across higher ed, we ought to make a strategic shift as a country to really deliver on employability on a sustained basis, and therefore more project-based learning, more skill-based learning, more skill-based assessments. And so in that way, I propose that higher ed civic education ought to be much more embedded into workforce development. And whereas K-12, I think that some of the foundational aspects and the more robust education that's tied to fundamental knowledge, U.S. history, the understanding of different nuances of civics, I think there's much more foundational civics that can happen in the K-12 side.
Well, and if you do what you said, Amit, and you have much more of the foundation at K-12, then you actually have more space for what you're talking about in the higher ed space around tying to workforce development, the project-based learning that is about coming together to deal with what are the problems today and how do we address them. So when Carol was talking about, what many people call the fourth industrial revolution, how are our students interacting with and becoming adept with this rise in AI, what it means for the workforce, and also, as you said, what the civic education challenges may be with that. So if it's something that you don't necessarily have the base knowledge for, you might not know all of the questions you may have around how to think critically about how we can use AI to best enhance learning and where we should be concerned because it might be a space for an accelerant for digitized disinformation, as you said, with synthetic deception and things like that. How are we engaging with our students? That's an area right there that's a sort of place to problem solve, and you don't know the end result. But if I was just in one of my seminars last week giving my students examples of, okay, take a question, and I won't repeat all of them here, but some of them are rather provocative, and ask for an answer. And they were things that I think would be what we would hear in this era of polarization. Ones like, are there certain races that are less intelligent? The difference you would get in an answer from Grok, do the students know this? Grok, ChatGPT, Claude AI, wildly different. And this is where students are getting information and being educated. So I think when you have that base knowledge about how do you think critically, how do you look into questioning those sites of knowledge and where they are getting their information, it all flows together. But I think that's a real space right now when we talk about how students can interact with something that is tied to their job opportunity, to how they want, also their world to look and their role in democratic self-governance. That AI piece is ripe for much work.
We'll bring you guys back for the second panel.
I think you're actually going to get some disagreement finally on this on this panel. And here's where I want to go with it. Not that I'm disagreeing with what you just said, Leah, but I am going to challenge the notion of defining job preparation and workforce development too narrowly. American University is a university committed to liberal education. What does that mean? It means it's committed to teaching students to think about the context, the big societal, cultural, scientific context in which they are doing their work. And when we start to talk about doing the foundational work in schools, we're basically outsourcing that broad learning to the schools when in fact we desperately need to reclaim it and to braid it through the entire educational experience so that students are thinking about whatever they're preparing to do, whether it's to be a welder or to be an accountant or to be a teacher or to be in public health, that they're thinking about the social forces that are bearing upon that profession, and so that they're prepared to anticipate as opposed to be the victims of things that are going to happen. And I believe that our national conversation is incredibly malformed to help Americans understand what they ought to be asking of college. So we're get a job, get the skills, workforce, et cetera, with no attention to what has been America's premier tradition, liberal education. Big picture liberal education woven through the entire educational experience as opposed to just done at the beginning or maybe in schools. It's a redesign that we need, and I think it begins with the language that we ourselves use in talking about this so that we have words like big picture arts and sciences, liberal education, enhancing as opposed to being done before job preparation. There's a lot of ways that we can pick up our language, and I think we need to do that.
I think it's important for us to really delve into this juxtaposition of career preparation and civic education, because I don't think anybody ever sat down and said, well, we shouldn't have civics in our education system along the whole spectrum from K-12 to college. It's just that for very understandable reasons, people want to be economically competent. Parents want their kids to get a good job. Young people going to college want to get into a good career pipeline. And so we've emphasized those things in our education system, but along the way we've neglected we've emphasized economic competence and we've neglected citizen competence. And so I think I agree it's important to integrate that into the paradigm of career preparation. But I think what Carol is getting at, and others who've been involved in the civic learning and democracy engagement work, every student, every degree, I commend that, because what I think it's calling for is a paradigm shift. We've had this paradigm of career preparation. We need a shift. If there's a lot at stake, and there's nothing guaranteed about the survival of constitutional democracy. And so this is really, really darn serious that we have a paradigm shift in our educational institutions toward its civic purpose.
And that's why this notion of productive citizens, that there's a key pillar on productivity, but then a key pillar on those foundational skills of being a citizen. And that's the trick, because we're trying to reimagine something that has existed in different forms in the country in a current environment. I mean, let's face it. I mean, the democracy we have today is really, really in crisis. And it's been not just a political comment for this particular situation. It's been going on for a decade plus. And so this moment we have right now, and this is where it's exciting for higher ed to really, we're the sandbox.
We're scary.
Right? In so many ways, higher ed is the innovation lab for so much of this kind of reimagination of how to deliver it on the goods, right? Of individuals that can lead self-sustaining, economically successful lives and be civically engaged.
Yeah.
And so this kind of reframing and discussion of what is the role of higher ed here is just spot on.
So let me try to weave the next question into this conversation. So I guess I just want to say, Amit, I completely agree with what you say about the importance to justify higher education in terms of careers and life opportunities. Just the price that we're charging makes it impossible not to worry about whether our students are going to be able to be employed. If they're underemployed, 40% of our graduates are underemployed in the sector as a whole. That's a really big problem. But I guess I would push back a little bit and say the civics part is not just about voting. It's not just about political participation. It's also about how you see yourself as a member of the community, how you see yourself as a member of a workplace. A workplace is a small political community. I know that we live in corporations where it feels like the people on top can order everyone else to do things. But the truth is that people have all kinds of ways of participating and shaping the conversation. And so trying to be more aware of rights and responsibilities as a member of a community seems that is a workplace skill, and we should try to explain it to the community as such. But let me try to get some maybe some daylight here. And this is a question to start with you, Amit. If we're committed to teaching civics, how should we measure whether or not they're succeeding? What should we measure? Right, that's really, because measurement is a normative question, as you know better than anyone else. What should we measure to know whether we're doing a good job? What should our priority be? Should it be knowing the Reconstruction amendments? Or should it be amorphous skills? I don't want to put too much spin on that baseball, but yeah, tell us.
So how do we measure higher ed progress today? At its most fundamental level, we measure it based on seat time. Right? 120 credit hours gets you an undergrad degree, and depending on which grad program you're working at, it could be 30, 60 or more credits. If it's graduate, PhD, it's even more. But we largely measure progress or attainment of higher ed based on, did you complete the courses or the seat time to graduate? And so there is a fundamental realization that many in the competency-based education movement have in higher ed, right? The CBE movement that says, wait a minute, it's not based on time in seat, it's actually based on the competencies learned, right? And so it's not time that's the ultimate progression driver, it's really, did you learn the skill? So there are many institutions now Some are entirely focused on competency-based education. Some are embedding it within the fabric. I think there's an opportunity for a hybrid measurement where you can start measuring competencies or skills. And the way I think about it, for those of us that have been in higher ed for a while, I like to remind, and it's also helpful for me to remind myself that when my kids were going through kindergarten or elementary school, we were measuring competencies. Did my little Alex or did my daughter Sophia demonstrate collaboration with her classmates, demonstrate, and then we get the little check mark during the parent-teacher conference. And I'm not trying to suggest we reduce all of higher ed to kindergarten and elementary school, though maybe there's some benefits to it, who knows. But I do think that civic education can be measured, and there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. And so this notion of thinking about an alternative to a transcript, because what's a transcript? The technology of a transcript that we all recognize in higher ed is a memorializing of what courses you took and what grades you got. That's how we measure, did you learn something, right? And it's largely, again, a time-based notion because it's credit hour-based. If you had a knowledge-based transcript that complements a skill-based transcript where some levels of civic activity both in the classroom and outside the classroom can give students credit, that starts to unlock really measuring things at that level. But that does mean engaging with your organization and others that are really working with faculty to think about how to engage with civics. That leads us to really think beyond what's happening in the classroom. But measuring what matters is key. And if we really believe that civics matters, we have to find new and different ways to measure it and give faculty, the registrar's office, the power to measure them and demonstrate them in different ways.
Let me pick up on something you said before, which is measuring what matters. And I just want to call up for our attention in the context of the neglect of civic learning across the entire continuum, that the last time NAEP looked at the civic and history knowledge of high school seniors was in 2010. So we keep getting the 8th grade results, but the fact of the matter is they are going through 4 more years of high school, and we don't have any interest as a nation in discovering for ourselves what knowledge of history or what civic dispositions and skills, motivations they may be bringing. We're just not asking that question. And therefore, higher education is flying blind, and it tries to say, what are we adding to those foundations, because we literally do not know. We may know that they had a social studies course and here were the criteria, but we don't know what individual students got out of it. And we in the coalition also have been talking to students, as Sign is, and we know that their memories of high school civics are really variable. For some, it was a world-changing experience that led them to what they're doing in college, and others literally do not remember what, if anything, they did. Literally do not remember. So we need to have that foundational knowledge. But then I want to argue that the real proof is not just going through a transcript of civic activities in college. Students should be doing projects, as several of us have said. They should be doing projects on issues they care about. And we can use rubrics to assess those projects and see whether or not the students even raised a civic question while doing a project. Was there any ethical reflection? If we have the right questions to ask about those projects, then we can determine for ourselves whether students just suffered through one more round of civics in the first year and that was it, or whether they actually began to bring those dispositions and mindsets that we're talking about to the work that they're actually doing to complete their degrees. So I would like to see us pull it all together around projects, around rubrics, and around making sure that the rubrics we're using to evaluate those projects are asking civic-minded and ethically responsible questions.
And I think that idea of project-based learning is something that goes through the life cycle of education, because here at the law school, I mean, you know, we have one of the strongest clinical programs of any law school in the nation and a model for clinical programs across the country. But also, I think even when you're talking about the measurements, within the ABA over the years, there's been a growth in a focus on experiential learning and experiential education. And so that is a part that, you know, when you're thinking K-12, higher ed, when you're thinking here in our graduate school, how students do that, there are a multitude of ways to incorporate that. And I do think it's a critical piece of the learning, because one of the things we also talked about on the call was this idea of when we asked the question whether students are prepared in terms of civic education when they come to higher ed, and I said, in my classes, I have a wide variety of students engaging with this topic, and this is law school. I mean, I start con law asking my students by a show of hands of like 90 students, how many of you read the Constitution in its entirety before ever coming to law school? And I mean, they're in law school, so you'd think everybody, but that's not true. And then I say, well, I hope by the end of this class you will never look at it the same way again, because our job is to really delve into it. But even in seminars with students who are interested in the topic, I also have a question as an icebreaker asking students what they learned about particular topics before they came into law school. And the Reconstruction Amendments was just an example of that, but there is a wild difference in terms of students' engagement with things like the history of enslavement in the United States, the abolitionist movement, the connection of enslavement to white supremacy. These are just topics that I think, for better or worse, sometimes we're afraid to show the dark parts of our history, but they lead to really interesting conversations about civic education, about how a nation emerges from something like that, comparisons with other countries about what have they done better or worse. And so I think all of that leads to the need to, in higher ed, understand that there is a real wanting for competency-based education, for students to be able to engage with discussion and discourse about things that they just simply have not had an opportunity to engage with before coming to this place.
I'd say, if we're going to have the right student outcomes, we need the creation of more courses likely as, and there needs to be, if we're going to have the paradigm shift that we need in higher education, we're going to see a flourishing of those kinds of courses. And the good news is that there are a lot of programs that are getting underway throughout the country, and Johns Hopkins University is making this a real priority. Of course, American University is making this a priority. Stanford University has a civics initiative. There's a number of public universities that are embarking on civics programs that are very ambitious, hiring a number of faculty, interdisciplinary programs that are taking civics seriously in academia. And for better or for worse, academia has often rewarded research, which is great. It's been a driver of a lot of progress in the world, but in the process, we've often neglected the teaching mission of our universities. And I would argue that we need to prioritize the teaching of our country's political tradition and how that relates to our daily lives.
Here's a fun exercise, if I could just take 1 second on. How many of you are on ChatGPT or another AI tool every day? Just about everybody, right? How many of our students here at AU are on it every day? Do we think just about all? Almost all, right? Simple exercise. You could do a prompt, and the prompt can say to ChatGPT or Grok or Claude or Gemini, any of the LLMs, ask me one by one 10 questions to test my civic literacy today. So just one by one, ask me questions, and then I will answer and then grade my answer. So one of the powers of where AI can come in is because right now there's over 300 million college students globally that are on just ChatGPT, and that's going to be, probably another 100 million next year. So you're seeing AI is becoming effectively a default tool for self-learning, for personalized learning. So there might be some projects, there might be some validation of knowledge that we can do as adults, but that we can also foster in college students as well. So I know it's not validated. I know there's going to be hallucinations. I know there's going to be all kind of bias. We have to accept it. To exactly Leah's point, the different platforms are not yet tuned properly and consistently. But there are fun ways that we can engage with students that involve knowledge, but also involve assessments. And there could even be some great projects around that as well.
Good. Okay. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So I hope all of you are thinking of super tricky questions to elicit the differences between our panelists. This is a question about civics in the rest of the curriculum. So sometimes when we talk about civics, we talk about a required class, which is a sort of a third rail in a lot of higher ed. But now I want to know about, does civics have a role in a student's education beyond required general education classes? Does it have a role in majors and in professional development? If so, what should that role be? I'm going to start with Carol, because I know that Carol has thoughts about this.
Few thoughts indeed. So, and more than I can give in a short answer to a panel question, and that is why you have that white handout on your tables. Our argument is that we need to redesign the curriculum in terms of purposeful pathways in which students are working on questions to which we don't know the answer, questions that matter to them, questions that may be salient in their own lives as well as in our political tradition, that we need, and there's a pathway on page 5, we need to introduce it in general education, reinforce it in majors, connect it to the experiential learning that students want, that employers want, that everybody wants, and help students find places and ways to put it together, whether that's in a capstone project or whether it's in an e-portfolio that they create themselves in which they reflect on what came out of their own education. We might have them describing to family, friends, and employers the major themes in their education. There are many ways in which we can put it together, but the notion is that it's not enough to think in terms of the course, so the course is necessary, and not enough to think in terms of the classroom, but rather we need a pathway strategy that will be simultaneously a redesign of civic preparation, job preparation, and a reinvigoration of liberal education so that it comes to matter as the context that we're weaving through the curriculum from first to final year. And one more thing that we haven't said that we definitely should say, 70% of Americans actually enroll in college at some point as adults. They don't all finish, but a larger numbers than most people know go to college. But what about the rest? And now I'm channeling my colleague Nancy Shapiro, who is smiling at me. Almost every teacher who teaches every student in America is prepared in our colleges. So as we create a civic ethos in our institutions and stronger civic learning for everybody in every career, including our teachers, we are in fact a force multiplier for needed repair in the way we think about our democracy and the way we work to make a democracy that serves everyone and not just some.
Well said.
You can drop the microphone if you want.
I know, mic drop. We
Just
can
kind
go
of
to
like
Q&A
call it.
now.
We'll just call it, yeah, Q&A now. I would just simply add that let's just empower professors and instructors and grad students to just really encourage them to embed exactly these elements there. I think the role of the faculty member is huge in this, and just as it is to rethink curriculum design, just really getting back to the basics of just the role of the faculty member to do that. And I think some of these elements can be in a science class. It could be in biology. It doesn't have to be in the classic social studies areas. There's so many ways, just a little bit of embedding some of these principles, right? It's what are the core knowledge elements, behaviors or skills, and then the dispositions we want to reinforce. And I think then letting faculty unleash.
Amit, would you say character formation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the discussion on character is at the 4th C. You've got communication and convening and
we lost the Cs,
collaboration.
yeah.
And Amy, are we adding a 4th one here on character? Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. This is the announcement, November 10th. Character added to the Sign Institute's pillars. I mean, at some level, character is a long discussion because what does it mean and how do you think about it and how does it evolve, right, in a pluralist society where there's different norms and definitions of what is character. But at a fundamental level, that is an element for the discussion.
Sure.
I would just emphasize what Carol mentioned about the preparation for our K-12 teaching force that happens in our universities. We tend to think K-12 is one system, higher ed is a totally separate system, and when people think about civics, again, they tend to think K-12. But where are most of our K-12 teachers getting their preparation? It's in our universities, and so there has to be, and one of the challenges that we're trying to make in our organization, the Jack Miller Center, and one of the, I would say that it's a great time right now for people in political science and history and other fields to get involved in the work of educating the K-12 teaching force at the graduate level through professional development programs for pre-service teachers. Certainly our schools of education have a critical role to play in all of this, but I would say across the disciplines, they should be, scholars should be paying attention to the way that we are getting elementary teachers, middle school, high school teachers ready to prepare the rising generation of citizens.
Amen to that. I mean, teachers are the force multiplier for both K-12 and higher ed.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Speaking as a teacher of higher ed.
Okay, why don't we turn to questions? We have some time for questions from the audience. It's not ask me anything, but it's ask me almost anything.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I appreciate this discussion. It's at a really critical time. I'm an AU alum. My name is Mickey Mitre. I'm an AU alum a couple decades ago, and a former USAID Foreign Service Officer, Democracy and Governance. And I served overseas for nearly a decade, for over a decade, and in countries that really flirted with authoritarianism. And it was shocking to me, in returning to the US, to see that we're going through this, what I saw 10 years ago, in places, Ukraine, with the first Russian invasion, that I think looking back there, and in Myanmar, where there was a genocide. And one of the pieces, the diagnosis that we had of both circumstances, was this lack of civic education, and how it led populations to believe really without that critical thinking. And one of our primary, as a practitioner, one of the primary tools we started to employ was media literacy, to be able to educate both students and the general population. And as much as I appreciate that it's within higher education, and that's the premise of the discussion, to that last point, that it really needs to be this continuum of engagement, not just at higher education and not just at teachers, but I would propose perhaps engaging students to go and do outreach to local schools, to teach in those civic education lessons as that's part of their project-based curriculum. So they're both engaging in the process, teaching it, and it creates this continuum so that they're in the process of civic education. It's not just learning the knowledge, but it's practicing it. And I think those are some of the things we tried to implement in Myanmar post-genocide. And so I would ask, has there been any consideration of engaging students in that whole process? Because that's something we tried to do before we get too far along the road here, and how things deteriorate. I've seen this play out.
Well, I'll do a little shout out here for a program that was founded at Washington College of Law many years ago, the Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Program. And so we do have students every year for the past couple of decades who are working with DC public school students each semester in teaching them about the Constitution, teaching them civic education. And so this program, it's flourished so much that it has been replicated nationally. There are even some international programs that are based on this model. So there needs to be more of it, but I fully agree that having that connection of our students going into K-12 schools, and these are high schools that they go into, and teaching an entire course on, the casebook I call it casebook, that's a law school term, the textbook that is used for the course, it's called We the People. I don't know, must be in like the 7th edition now. It was created by Jamie Raskin when he was on our faculty here before he was in the United States Congress. And it is a way, I think, to make that bridge and connect it. But I agree with you that it's all the more critical now, and I think there are ways in which a gap in civic knowledge allows for the rise, obviously, in authoritarianism. And if people, even when we're talking about the benefits of AI and how wonderful this is as a tool for increasing knowledge, it is a tool to instantiate inequality, authoritarianism. I'm not saying it has to do that, but I'm saying we need to be aware of how it's been used historically, like the role of IBM in the Holocaust and in being a corporation that worked with Nazis to round up people. That's one way you can use technology. Maybe we don't want to use it that way. But if we don't know about that history, how do we know that in current times, how do we know to be aware that this could be a tool that's used for evil and not for good? I think all of this is important. And so I think there are two pieces to that. Your discussion of the importance of connecting the higher education to K-12 and the students in that, but also I think having a knowledge of what it means to have a rise in authoritarianism. So how many students know about what happened in Ukraine, about Hungary, about Myanmar? And so I think those are also pieces that, and Carol has, I think this is a part of CLDE as well, right? When you're talking about our constitutional democracy, it's also learning about, other countries, other forms of government, other challenges that have been a part of those forms of government, because it helps our students to be more aware and therefore have a stronger voice.
I'm just going to say amen to the question and amen to the answer. We absolutely need to have many more opportunities for many more students to be pulling together what we've talked about across this panel, the constructive civil discourse, with the searching, probing of what's happening in other parts of the world and what's happening in our own society, as the increase in distrust feeds the dissolution of the democracy in which we take so much pride. So we need many more people working on these issues, and I'm grateful for the question.
I'm grateful for the global context, too, because I think that, look, we're 50 states, and in a federalist system, we have states that have different flavors of democracy. We have some states with open primaries, some states with closed primaries, some states with more balanced districts, and some states that are completely gerrymandered, some states that have a way for individuals, including students, to more easily become registered to vote. In other states that it's just really tough. So even in the United States, we have things that are approaching Hungary, things that are approaching other states that are, at best quasi-democratic. So it's actually interesting to look at these global benchmarks, because we can look at the other and they go, wait a minute, is this what's happening in this state, or is this what's happening in this municipality? And how do we reimagine it? And I think one of the things that, Leah, you pointed out is it's just a reminder that our 250-year history has been various forms of democracy along the way. I mean, we're really nuanced. We were really largely an oligarchy, an oligarchic democracy when we were founded, right? It was founding fathers. It was landowners. They were of the same race. It was a tight community that created democracy. And then we became more participatory over the years, and then boom, around, and then we had the Civil War, and then you think about the 1920s when you had the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and, this kind of very, very wealthy class that was largely driving the political institutions of the country, which then led to FDR and a different participatory. And we're kind of in that swing right now, between oligarchic concentration of wealth driving politics versus a more participatory. So even in our history, let alone state by state, we've had that. So these global references are helpful to just kind of help students take a step and go, okay, where exactly are we as a country? But I think just as importantly, where are we as a state? And to kind of remind ourselves that these international references can help make that more real.
Okay, more questions.
Hi, everyone. You have another person from USAID here. I don't care. We worked together. I was also in USAID's Democracy and Governance Bureau working on designing interventions overseas. And so to see what's happening here, it's a slight reality check. So the discussion was fascinating. I just wanted to flag maybe some gaps or concerns. I feel like from everything I'm seeing, the job landscape in the next 5-10 years is going to be radically different. And so some of what I'm seeing from you all as solutions or recommendations is concerning because it seems slightly static. And I don't see the uncertainty there. And I don't see the iteration. And I don't see also folks, maybe you have consulted, but folks from the tech side, from the innovator side, and I think our graduates really need to, we're starting to see it now, where Amazon is cutting jobs, a lot of the other folks are, this is just like the baby wave. And so what do you tell students 5 years from now where there's no guarantee if the stats are 40%, someone mentioned, what if it's 80%? And I think there has to be a broader discussion. Yes, civics is huge and civics is important, but like what kind of nation and society and how do we prepare for that? I have lots of others, but I just want to throw this out there.
Amazing, at 2:30. Yeah. Fellow panelists.
Well, I think this is tied to what I was mentioning earlier about when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution and what is happening with the rise of tech and AI, this is the million-dollar question or billion-dollar question around students, around workforce. I also created this seminar last year that was about sort of looking at contemporary issues in AI and civil rights, and I would ask my students each week, we had a little bit of time to say, just bring in a question that you have flagged, that you think is at this intersection of AI and justice. It could be anything. It could be like what you found on a dating site, or it could be a meta question about, voter participation. And there was a lot of discussion about the job question, and are we not going to have jobs because AI will eliminate them? And I think part of that goes to, and I assume this will be part of a discussion this afternoon, but the notion that I do think it's imperative for all of us to become more facile with what's happening with the rise of technology, with all of the iterations, which is to say what it means in a classroom, how often students are using ChatGPT. I think they're using it all the time, but I think my job is to say, look at what Grok said, and ChatGPT, and Claude AI. Look at the differences. Look at what is synthetic deception. What does it mean to have hallucinations? There are ways in which, this is devoid of the critical thinking piece that Amit said was so important. And I would like to think two things. One, that critical thinking piece is always necessary. There are things that are not replaceable by AI. But secondly, I think our discussion of civic education is intimately tied to this issue of the rise of technology, because there are very big questions about what is happening in terms of exacerbating the educational chasm, in terms of a rise of authoritarianism that are directly tied to a rise in technology. It allows for digitized disinformation. It allows for the polarization we are talking about. And if people don't have the civic education to say, hey, this isn't right, or this is what authoritarianism looks like, or this is a synthetic deception that is trying to shape, feeding me misinformation about how I am participating in our democracy and in our voting, then we go further down that path. So I think this is what I would say falls into the Carroll discussion of problem solving. I don't think we have the answers for it, but I think it is imperative in higher education to engage with the questions, to interface and interact with our students on these issues, and honestly, as faculty, to not be afraid. I mean, I think there are plenty of faculty who are like, I don't want to touch this. This isn't how I do research. I don't know what Grok is. And so I think it's also a call for education professionals to actually become more familiar with this. And so, I was at a big law and tech summit a couple of weeks ago that was dealing with this very issue. So I think more educators need to be involved on this topic.
Let me try to tackle the question about jobs disappearing. And now I'm channeling Anthony Carnevale, whom, as many of you will know, set up the Center at Georgetown for Education in the Workforce. And he was on the board when I was president of ASCNU for many years. So I had a lot of tutorials on this under preparation for the jobs you have. And the way Tony taught me to think about it was getting a job in the economy gives you access to opportunities for continued learning and further work. Absent that job, you don't have that access. So students may indeed be hired into something that could have been done by somebody who didn't have a degree. The question is, will that organization want to keep them? Every organization in our economy is driven by innovation. So they're looking for people who can be innovators, who have worked on projects, who've tried to create problems, and who will anticipate some of the issues that are coming up around the corner. Now I'll put my liberal education hat on. We've too often let ourselves hear about soft skills or one skill, critical thinking. We actually, the employer community is actually starting to use the term durable skills. And those durable skills are the capacities developed through a strong liberal education, critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, the ability to work with others, listening, creativity, curiosity. All those things are what give you access to continued opportunity in the economy. And therefore, even if your initial job isn't quite what you hoped it would be, the question is, are you persuading those who employed you, or someone who might employ you next, that you have the capacities, those durable skills, I used to call them liberal education skills, to go the distance in your life and in our democracy as well.
I just want to tag on one quick point that, Carol, you reminded me of. I had a bunch of sort of experts in the field and speakers come in to talk to my students, and one of them, who is working in big business now in tech, but has also worked as a law professor and has worked in a civil rights organization, she said to my students, and I thought this was helpful, she said, every single job I've had didn't exist before I had it.
Right.
Every single one. And she said it as though, so therefore don't worry about it. She said, I'm doing stuff that people weren't doing, 10, 15 years ago. And so if you have the durable skills that Carol is referencing, when you're in these spaces, there are other things that also develop. And so I thought it was actually really great advice to my students who were worried.
I just have to say that my former husband said that to my parents when they asked what he was going to do. He said, I don't think the job I will have has yet been invented, and they were seriously displeased. But it was true. It was true. Every job he has had and every job I have had did not exist before we invented it while holding it. So
That's what coming. Amy is going to bring the hook and pull me off the stage. And so, in an effort to avoid violence, why don't we have final reflections? So, Hans, would you like to?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just say quickly, building on this conversation. What do we need? We need civic confidence in a time of turmoil and rapid change, technologically, economically, uncertainty. And you look at the doubts that young people have in surveys about constitutional democracy. It's alarming, and yet, what do we need to aim for? We need to aim for confidence in our institutions, in one another, and that does not happen without a strong emphasis and much stronger emphasis than we've had for a long time in our country on civic education.
I'm going to leave with a message of hope here, because I really believe that, just building on that last question and the whole conversation, I know this is a heavy topic, civics, workforce readiness, but we actually do know the core skills that are going to be relevant in 5 years, that are going to be relevant in 10 years. And these are critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and I'll invite citizenship or civics into that. And we can horizontally, for every student, look at ways to measure and monitor progress in those skill areas. I want to empower career services to really be thinking competency-based. I want to really invite leadership in higher ed across the country to think about how do you measure the building blocks of that competency, to break with the time-based, credit-based approach and say, that's not enough that I just graduated that student or even got them a job. That first job ain't enough. I want to teach foundational skills that are so embedded into that student so we know what to do, we know what skills are out there, and we know how to do that. We can measure this along the way, but it takes intention, it takes attention, it takes some duration and time and energy, but we can actually build these skills for a productive citizenry in the country. It'll take time, but we know what to do. And I think that this kind of conversation, thanks to the Sign Institute, thanks to all the great work that the team's doing here to make this kind of conversation possible, and let's just amplify that message that we know what we can do. We just got to get out there and do it. And I would add AI literacy to that mix as well, because we got to measure the heck of how to effectively and responsibly measure AI engagement.
Any final words, Carol?
I think I'll finish with the most important lesson that I've learned through the work that we've been doing in the coalition and before that with other organizations around the country. And it's to start by asking the students what's on their mind, which of course this conference began with. We had a survey telling us what young people think. We had students on the opening panel. We have students in the audience. We need to ask them what they are concerned about, whether it's in their democracy, in their communities, in their lives, in their notion of what they're doing as in preparing for careers, and connect with their questions, so that we need to tell them early and often that anything they're concerned about can be studied through the college curriculum, writ large, including the experiential learning and work in communities as well. So we have to help them see that the curriculum itself, again, writ large, is their best hope for bringing their own time and talent to issues that they really care about. And that, I think, will be an investment not just in them, but in the democracy that they will help create.
Leah, would you like the last word?
Not really, but I feel like it has to be so profound.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with my co-panelists. I believe, obviously, I'm a professor. I believe very deeply in civic education, and I think it is really it's a disruptor of historic injustice. And if students don't have that base knowledge, they are ill-equipped to actually address what is happening today with the crisis in our democracy. And so I think they are intricately tied together. I think that it is critical for every domain. It doesn't have to just be a law student. It could be a scientist that needs to know this. And so I am very grateful that we are engaged in this discussion here and that we are doing our best to try to shed a light on it.
Right.
Thanks, everybody. Can we please thank especially Professor Merrill for being, I say, the conductor of the orchestra and keeping everything together, but thank you so. You did your sports reference, I did we're arts, we're also doing that. And thank you to our esteemed panel for sharing all of their information. We are grateful for you coming today. We are continuing on. I am gonna ask you a very big favor. We are going to, lunch is provided for you. If you could get your lunch rather quickly and come back right at noon, we are going to have our presidential speaker series, and we want to start right on time. So if you could just get your lunch and come back. But one more round of applause for our incredible panel. Thank you so much.